Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 24 Hours of Past session, Writing User Stories and Slicing Epics for Data Warehousing and Business Intelligence Teams. I'm proud to present our presenter, Lynn Winterboer. I'll let her say a little bit more about herself as an introduction, but I'll start off on just a couple of minutes to tell you about the session and some additional information you might like to know. So this 24 Hours of Past event consists of 24 consecutive live webinars delivered by expert speakers. The sessions are all going to be recorded and posted online after the event. So you can actually go to 24hoursofpast.com to get those once they're available, but it may take a day or two for those to be available. I'll just do a quick introduction of myself. My name is Anil Desai. I'm an independent consultant based in Austin, Texas. And I do a lot of .NET and SQL Server work, as well as a lot of cloud and data center work with Azure as well. I'm also a Microsoft MVP. Okay, so just talk about if you need any technical assistance. If you have any questions, just go ahead and type them into the question pane, as you'll see that in the right pane of your screen. I'll be watching for those, and we'll save most of the technical questions. If they're ones that I can answer, I'll be happy to do that. Otherwise, I'll save them till the end, just to keep the flow of the session going with such a large number of attendees. You also have the ability to maximize your screen with the Zoom button if you want to add some more space there. And you can fill in a short survey that will appear at the end. And then could you advance two slides, please?
Oh, there you go.
Get to the sponsor. Great, thank you. Okay, so before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank our presenting sponsors, Quest, Melissa Global Intelligence, and Nutanix. The staging of 24 Hours of Past would not be possible without their generous support, and that's the reason this free event is available. So thanks to them. Okay, I just want to mention a little bit about PASS, pretty easy to find at pass.org. You can access a lot of online training and content for free. You have local groups and virtual groups, so if you want to find other experts in your area, that's a great place to start. And also there's discounted rates for events available there as well. And so we go, yep, next slide, great. And so I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to, oh, I'm sorry, one last thing. Before I hand it over to Lynn, there's the upcoming PASS Summit, which is October 31st to November 3rd in Seattle. And it features over 200 sessions with world-class data experts that you get to see live. If you want more information on that, just go to passsummit.com. Okay, that's it for the introduction. So I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to Lynn. Lynn, take it away.
Great, thanks, Anil. Okay, so I am Lynn Winterboer. I am an Agile Analytics educator and coach, and I focus on bringing Agile principles and practices to business intelligence, data warehousing, and analytics teams. I have 20 years of experience in both data warehousing, BI, and in Agile approaches. And I serve as the co-chair for the annual Mile High Agile Conference here in Denver, which has 800 attendees, and we focus on Agile and lean topics. And then I also organize a local Agile Denver data and analytics meetup, a monthly meetup where we talk about bringing Agile to data-focused teams. There's some other stuff there about me. If you are a tweeter, I do like to have people tweet about my presentations at AgileLyn, so that's welcome and encouraged, and then also LinkedIn if that is what you do as well. So we're going to start off today talking about Agile foundations. Just a quick overview for those of you who are new to Agile or aren't really sure what it is. A lot of people think Agile is Scrum, which is the most popular Agile framework for applying the principles and values to work. However, the term Agile really comes from this thing called the Agile Manifesto, which was developed in 2001 by the group of people listed at the bottom of the screen there. And this is called the Agile Manifesto, and these are the 4 values. I'm not going to go into detail about these, just other than to say when people use the term Agile, the true meaning of that term from a software development standpoint is really more of a mindset shift and a set of values and principles over any specific framework that people are used to hearing, like Scrum or Kanban or XP, for example. There are also, along with the Agile Manifesto, the 4 values, there are 12 principles, and I have selected 3 of those 12 to focus on today that are related to writing user stories. Before I explain what those three are, I want to give a little insight into just a overview definition that a user story is a representation of a small piece of functionality that would bring, put together with other pieces of functionality, would bring value to our data customers. And so think of the user story as a very, very small requirement. I'll explain why user stories are not exactly requirements in a bit, but if you think about them as very small pieces of functionality, they're a request from the business or our customers for something small. So one of the Agile principles is that our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. And I put the word insight in there because that's what's really applies to us in the data world, is we want to deliver early and continuous delivery of valuable insight. The reason I mentioned that user stories are very small requirements is that in order to deliver early and continuously, they need to be small. Frankly. So that's why this term user stories came to be, was to have things be small enough that we could deliver early and continuously. The second principle I want to focus on is that we welcome changing requirements even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. And this is probably my favorite of the Agile principles, because in 20 years of doing data work, my background is primarily as a business analyst or a project manager. I've found that no matter how beautiful of a huge, gorgeous, well-detailed business requirements document I can write, things still change. And the more I matured in my learning experience as a worker, I realized that things should change. Healthy companies, especially in this day and age, are reacting to their market, are reacting to opportunities, are reacting to changes in skill set in their workforce. Whatever it is that's changing, the company needs to be adapting to that. And so this old way of saying we're going to write one big requirements document and then it's going to be the Bible for that project for the next 6, 12, or 18 months, it's just not effective in keeping companies competitive in the marketplace. So I really like how Agile approaches really change the attitude of that and say we're going to welcome changing requirements and be excited that we can absorb them gracefully. Part of absorbing them gracefully is, again, that they're small. So while the team is working on requirement A, the business can be figuring out what the next thing is that the team should be working on, or maybe what requirement Q is. Like they might be down in that list of priorities working away. And so having small pieces of work that the team focuses on allows the business to continue to evolve what comes next without disrupting the team from the piece that they're working on. And then the third Agile principle that I think really applies to writing user stories is that working software, or in our case, insight, is the primary measure of progress. And so if we're not going to, in Agile, we don't look at things, sunk cost, things like how many hours have been spent or how much money has been spent. We look at how many of these user stories have been completed and are accepted by the business and ready to move into production. And so, again, if you're going to use working insight or functional insight as the primary measure of progress, you have to have lots of small pieces so that you have a measurement. If in the waterfall way of working, you really have one delivery at the end, and that doesn't make it a measurement. That's not a useful measurement along the delivery path for that project. So in Agile, we break things into smaller pieces. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about user stories. So contrary to popular opinion, our BI needs are not driven by our source data. Our data simply supports good decision making, and our users have stories to tell us, and they don't usually tell us stories about the data. They usually tell us, if you were to go have coffee with one of your users, they probably say things like, wow, I'm really worried about which decision we should make here, or I just don't have enough information and it takes me a long time to sift through it by hand. They tell you a story about their life. And so therefore, Agile analytics is very story driven, and Agile is very story driven. So I'm going to give you a framework for understanding how little teeny stories fit into the whole. In this example, this might be a project that would have to do with corporate property management, for example. Actually, this project might be bigger than that because managed corporate properties is one of the capabilities within this project. I think when you're looking at this level, projects typically have, 3 to 5 capabilities at this level. So a capability is a very big piece of functionality or a very big capability. And then a single capability could break down into multiple smaller things. In this case, I've called them features. So the manage corporate properties capability might break into the manage rental rates feature, the invest wisely in renovations feature, and the manage property insurance feature. These, by the way, came from a real example with working with the client to help them take their big goal of what they wanted to achieve and break it down into smaller things that they could work on. So then a single feature might break down into something I'm calling epics. So this feature of invest wisely in renovations might have 2 epics of several that say identify properties that need renovation and then evaluate the renovation ROI for those properties that need renovation. And this goal, this group was trying to decide where to put the money for the year. They have a limited budget of properties they could renovate. This example comes from a bank that has lots of branches that you and I might go into. So you can imagine that if you walk into one branch and it's kind of tired and dated and obviously needs renovation, that I'm sorry, I got distracted by somebody tweeting, which is very nice. I should turn that off. So if you walk into a branch and it needs renovation, it feels a little tired. You kind of wonder if it's successful and if you should be doing business there. Whereas if you walk into a branch that's been newly renovated, you get a much better feel. And their experience shows that newly renovated branches do a lot more business. But again, they have a limited amount of resources or a limited amount of money to spend on renovation each year, so they have to make careful decisions. This group was actually going after the renovation ROI, but when we started breaking it down and talking about what they needed, and we actually had the business leader who's responsible for the budgeting decisions, he was in the room, and he started thinking about, before I can figure out ROI, I got to figure out what needs renovation. And so when we asked him more questions about, well, how do you identify properties needing renovation? The stories, which are these little pieces of work that the team's going to work on, came back to be that, first of all, he wants to see properties that have never been renovated. And that was very interesting to him, like that there probably are some out there. And then he wanted to see properties renovated by age. So the ones we know have been renovated, how long has it been since they've been renovated? And then based on that information, he wanted to come up with the most likely renovation targets. Then he would go do the work to figure out the ROI on renovating those properties. Now what's interesting here is the BI team and the data team was pushing back on him on properties, on breaking it this small. And he explained his business logic to this. And they were saying, well, I can't imagine you're going to find value in getting a list of properties that have never been renovated. Like, what are you going to do with that? And he gave him a good business scenario for that. He said, I need to look at that list because I know we've grown by acquisition. We've bought a lot of properties. And I'm guessing that in that process, we don't necessarily get the last renovated date in our system when we acquire properties. He goes, I'm concerned. He said, I'd like to see a proper, his example was a property that was, let's say, purchased in 2014, and it's listed as never renovated, so that would move it over to maybe having a likely renovation target. But if he discovers that the property was the actual building was built in 2012, then he's going to assume in that case that property renovation date was 2012. If it's a property they purchased in 2014 and the building was built in 1966 and he doesn't have any information on when it was renovated, he actually would call up that branch manager and say, what do you think? When do you think it was last renovated? Or figure out another way to get that data in there. Because he says, heavens forbid we bought something that was built in 1966 and has not been renovated. So it was really, when you're breaking down a project from really big things into little things, an important aspect of that is conversation not only with the business person, but with the whole team. Because when the whole team was in that conversation, the team that was going to be delivering on this, and heard his logic, they understood, and it connected them to what value they would be bringing so much more than if it was written down by one person and brought back to the team. So that's an agile practices. A lot of the team is involved in much of the work together. But I'm not going to go into that today. But if you're interested in that, you're welcome to contact me and I can tell you more about that. So one point I want to make about capabilities to stories here is these are terms that I use. Capability is a big thing, features a middle, epic is smaller, and stories the smallest. What you'll find out in the market is the nomenclature for these hierarchies varies very widely. Some of the agile tools call epics the biggest things and feature the middle things. It doesn't matter what you call them. What matters is that your whole group that's working on this together and your business customers all agree on the nomenclature. So pick a hierarchy and have everybody agree on it. In fact, there are some teams that just everything's a story. These are bigger stories, these are middle stories, these are smaller stories. People get kind of hung up on that, but don't get hung up on that. Just pick something and make sure everybody's on the same page and move forward. So the user story has a typical template that is often used. This isn't the only way to write user stories, and if you find you're spending way too much time trying to get the small piece of functionality articulated in this format, you might let it go. You might try something else. However, when you're starting out, this is a very helpful template, and I'll explain why. And some teams who've been doing Agile for years still use this template. It's not just training wheels. So the format is, as a certain role, I need the ability to do something so that I can achieve a certain goal. So here's an example from the prior screen. As a corporate properties manager, I need the ability to view properties by renovation age so that I can determine the most likely renovation targets for the upcoming year. So we are used to, in the data world, getting that middle thing. We're used to getting a requirement that says view properties by renovation age. But what we're not used to getting is the corporate properties manager. Who is that? What is his role? I actually, when I was working through this with this team, I was curious. I said, well, describe to me what you do. Like, what's the scope of that role? That's not a title I've run across before. And what I found is, as he was describing his role, several people on the team were really leaning in. They were curious. They didn't know what that role was. They knew in general kind of what they did. They knew what kind of data they asked, but they'd never had the opportunity to ask that person, what do you do? You know, just explain to me how, what you do for this company. And in a non-threatening way. So that was really helpful to the team to put some perspective around what this person was asking for. And then the last part, so that I can determine the most likely renovation targets for the upcoming year. If this business person hadn't already known that there probably were some missing renovation dates, somebody on the data team probably would have known that and said, well, actually, renovation age implies that it's the time between today and the last time renovated. And we have a lot of renovation dates that aren't populated because of acquisitions. And then that would have led to a more interesting conversation with the business person and would have saved the business person a lot of time, because they could have stepped back and said, oh, I've got some data cleanup I need to do. So that's one example of a user story using this template. Here's another one. As a distribution manager, I need the ability to understand average monthly revenue per gallon on each route so that I can decide whether to change routes to be more profitable. This example came from a large dairy conglomerate that also did deliveries. They had cooler trucks that took milk to various places. And so this was, again, something interesting to understand. They want revenue per gallon, and then they want to be looking at how can I make a route more profitable. And some of the decisions that the conversation that came out of this user story were things like, how do you make routes more profitable? And he said, well, sometimes I'll send a truck out and I'll have the driver spend the night. There'll be in a big loop that takes them one day to get up to the top of the loop and then the second day to come back. And then I pay for that driver to spend the night. Or other times it might be better to have one big truck go someplace and then move the milk to smaller trucks to then disperse from there. So having these conversations about who the role is, what they do, what they want, which we're used to getting, but then what they're going to do with the data really helps the team participate in delivering value to the company. Not just to be nice to the team, but the team, we in the data world, we know a lot. We know a lot about the data, but give us the ability to also understand how it's being used in the business, and we can really bring additional value. So a well-written story represents business value to the user community. It is demonstrable to users as a working feature. It might be a little teeny feature, but you can demonstrate it. It describes what the business needs, not how to deliver it. That's really important. This example, a profitability analyst needs the ability to examine profitability by individual store per month so that he can help the least profitable stores become more profitable. So stories are not requirements. I mentioned that at the beginning. They represent requirements. So it's a placeholder that, or a promise to have a conversation that goes more into detail just in time. So at the right point in time when the team is ready to start working on that story, that's when the conversation happens. Typically, the team should be seeing stories in a prioritized backlog so that they could just read through those sentences and get a sense for what's coming. But again, keep in mind we welcome changing requirements. So if the team is working on items number 1, 2, and 3 in a prioritized backlog, the business can be, taking number 10 and moving it up to number 7, and taking number 4 and moving it down to number 30. If that's what, as the business evolves, if that's what's needed, that's certainly acceptable in an agile approach. But when it's time for the team to start thinking about the work, which is typically a couple weeks ahead of when they're going to start the actual work, then they're going to have the conversation. And the conversation is a collaboration between the stakeholders that need the work, the business analysts, the testers, the developers, the data modelers, anybody else that's involved in delivering this piece of functionality. And the conversation creates a shared understanding between those groups. Some of the details that might be in the conversation include a more detailed story description. So you've got the one sentence, but then you can certainly put a lot more information behind that sentence as the team needs it, as necessary. You don't always fill out a ton of detail for every story, because there might be some stories the team is very familiar with the data and the business process, and they understand with the one sentence what to do. And other stories, they have a lot of questions, and they might want to have some things jotted down to remind them of them. Use case models are often used in Agile for teams that are used to using them. You don't have to do them, but they could be included. They're very helpful here. When we talk about notes or lo-fi sketches, lo-fi would be an example would be drawing, taking notes on a whiteboard or sketching something out on a whiteboard and then taking a picture. So I love to draw things in Visio and PowerPoint. I'm really a visual person, and as a business analyst, it's something that I really enjoy doing. But I have had to accept that my kind of cruddy and slanted handwriting and the fact that I can't draw a square box on a whiteboard is okay. They still know what it means. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I don't need to spend an hour or two taking the information from the whiteboard and transcribing it into Visio, unless that serves a purpose down the road. But if that's good enough for the team to get started, I let that be. Really important part of this conversation is to define the acceptance criteria for that piece of work. So how will the users know that the team has delivered what they need? What's that goal line? And the acceptance criteria is a really important aspect of this, because it tells the team exactly what the business person is going to look for to say, yep, that meets my need, thank you. I gave my need in a high-level user story, we had a conversation, and we got more details, and now here's what I'm going to look for to make sure it's done. Now, acceptance criteria needs to be very specific. So for example, if somebody's asking for a week-over-week sales trend, and the acceptance criteria, they articulate that the acceptance criteria is they're going to compare it to a manually calculated week-over-week sales trend. You'd say, okay, all right, well, how are you going to manually calculate that? Are you going to use Excel? What formulas are you going to use? That's important information to us, because they're actually doing a little pseudo-coding in doing that. And then if they say they want it over 3 years, I've seen teams say, great, when you've done all those manual calculations for 3 years, and keep in mind, 2 years ago, we did a rip and replace of our sales management system, so you're going to have to go back to the old system, then come back to us, and that's when the story will be ready for us to work on it. Or the person might say, you know, if you can do week over week sales trend for the past 5 weeks or the past quarter, I'm good. Then you know what your goal line is. And so keep in mind that comment where I said, you know, 2 years ago we did a rip and replace on our sales management system. Those are the kinds of things that in the data world really goof us up. Because we might feel like, oh, we did it, we can prove it for a quarter, and they're looking back 3 years and they're concerned, and we didn't, you know, depending on how we did that replacement of that source system and how that impacted the warehouse, that could be easy to do or it could be really hard to do. And this is the time to have that conversation, not after we've delivered something that disappointed them. So the acceptance criteria lets us know very clearly how to delight our customer. It is very difficult to write acceptance criteria. It's a big challenge for the business requester, and they often need a lot of support from the team, from business analysts and testers in particular. It can be really helpful. That's all I'm going to say about acceptance criteria in this webinar. So then some of the benefits of just-in-time requirements include, you know, avoiding stale and outdated understanding of the requirement. So, you know, we've all done this where we spent time in a room understanding something, and then 6 months later it's time to develop it, and we have to go back and remember, now what did we mean by that word in the document? So having that conversation much closer to when the design, development, and testing will happen is really helpful for those people doing that work. It also helps us avoid doing comprehensive analysis of requirements that end up changing or being canceled. And we've all been there. We've all had that happen as well. So if we leave the discussion, the details of what's needed until it gets closer to when the team's going to work on it, it's much more likely that that priority is going to stick and be the thing the team works on. Much more likely. And so that reduces waste, basically. And the other thing is, when we have just-in-time requirements discussions, we can start building a working system much sooner. And the reason that is if we have, let's say we have 10 small things that have been prioritized 1 through 10 on this project, and the business knows, yes, we absolutely need these 10, the team can start working on number 1 and then move to number 2 and then move to number 3 in order, while the business figures out numbers 11 through 379, right? Or 11 through 20, and then while we're working on that batch, they can go for the next batch. So it allows us to get working much sooner. We don't have to sit around and wait for detailed requirements for the whole project to be written. And that's part of one of those values of early and continuous delivery of value to the business, one of the principles that I spoke about earlier on. So we talk about user story being functional, fully functional, or as close to fully functional as possible. And what we mean by that is we want it to be very architecturally complete. So what's up here right now is a standard, common architecture, set of architectural layers for data warehousing and BI. So you would start with the source data on the left and extract it into the stage layer. And then from stage to integration, there's some transformations. And then you load it into the warehouse and possibly some other transformations. And then probably derive some things out of the warehouse, derive some things in the OLAP or analytics or metadata layer. And then finally it hits the front end, where the business users actually access the data. So given this as an example of an architecture, you might see a user story come in. As a sales forecaster, I need the ability to see the number of transactions per day. That sales forecaster is going to be looking at the BI app or at whatever your front-end delivery mechanism is to get that information. And that's what they want to see in the end. So we are going to think about doing just-in-time design and development to pull whatever is needed for that user story through all the layers of our architecture. And that would mean that we would develop the ETL to pull the transactions into staging. We'd add the transaction data to the data model and integration. We'd add the transaction count field to the fact table in the warehouse, et cetera, et cetera. We would do each of those things in each of the layers. Oh, and by the way, we're going to test all of those modules and make sure that each one has worked correctly. So the comment I want to make here is, those of you who are on the call who are experienced in data warehousing in particular, and probably data modelers or ETL developers, are looking at this and thinking, wow, this is really technically inefficient. It's so much faster for me to pull all the data for those tables from source to stage than to just pull what I need. It's so much easier for me to model all of the data going into the integration than just doing them one at a time. And it might be for those roles in the value pipeline or the value chain of delivering this functionality. There might be some efficiencies gained by doing more requirements at one time than just a single one. However, what I want to point out is that for other parts of that value chain, such as testing or maintenance and support in production, doing all of those things might create more work in the end for the whole value chain. And this is a topic I'm very passionate about, and I welcome you to reach out to me if you're interested in talking about this more. I'm happy to. But think about this sort of as you might trade off technical efficiency for business efficiency. So from the sense of you're looking at the value chain across the whole time, you're looking at not only the technical aspects of it, like including testing and support, but you're also looking at getting this answer to the sales forecaster sooner so they can do something useful with it in the business and make better decisions or move more quickly in their business processes. So think about this as being willing to trade off technical efficiency for business efficiency for the betterment of the whole. And that's really what we're shooting for when we talk about a small user story and making it architecturally complete. And we have a little bit more on that when we get into slicing. So if you've still got questions, hold them for just a bit. So you've learned a little bit about user stories in the data world. And I know this is probably very hard to see, and it's okay. You don't actually need to be able to read any of the words on here. But I'm going to ask you to think in your mind rather than out loud because I can't hear you, how many user stories do you think it would take to deliver this report? So hopefully you're all leaning in and squinting at your screen. Since I can't hear you and hear your thoughts on this, I'm going to just tell you what audiences typically say on this slide, and I get a range of anywhere from 1 user story to 100. And they're all right. I am a consultant, so the answer is it depends. And the reason it depends, here's the perspective on it. If each one of these metrics is already sitting in your warehouse pre-calculated, each one of the numbers and the percentages is there, and all the team has to do is reveal it on a report and format it like this, that's probably 1 user story. That's probably something the team could do in a short amount of time and get feedback from the business. However, if each of these percentages has a numerator and a denominator, and each of those elements comes from 5 different systems, and you've never touched any of those 5 systems, this could be 1,000 user stories. I don't know, it could be a ton. So the answer of what is a user story really depends on what the team with those skills in that situation can deliver in a short amount of time. So there is no rule of thumb that a user story is a report or a user story is a dashboard. It's a matter of the capacity of that team with the knowledge they have and the situation they're in with how much has already been built out versus how much they have to bring in new. Okay, now we're going to get into slicing stories. So if you have something that's bigger than the team can do in a short amount of time, how do you slice it smaller? So if you think back to that capabilities, features, epics, and stories diagram at the beginning, let's say we're at the epic level and we need to slice epics smaller. The reason we would need to slice them smaller is an epic is anything that's too big to fit into a single iteration. This is my definition, keep in mind. This is what I call an epic, and keep in mind there's a lot of variety out there of how people use the term epic. But for me, if it's too big to fit into a single iteration, for teams that are doing Scrum or XP, that might be anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks is their iteration length, and they keep that consistent. Even teams who are doing a pull-based, flow-based, agile approach like Kanban might still say, we want to slice stories small enough that we think we could do them in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever, or 1 week. Whatever that team decides is their cadence that they want to follow. So if it's something that's too big for that team with their skills and their availability in the upcoming sprint, or iteration, and the situation they're in with what's been built before them, if it's too big for them to do in a small amount of time, they get to say, okay, we need to slice this smaller. So one of the first things that data warehousing and BI teams do is they say, oh, we're going to slice it into a data warehouse story and a BI story. And I'm going to suggest you want to really avoid that. It's a temptation, but what happens there is that then we're separating the data warehouse work from the business value. If the business value comes in at the BI in the end, and we do the data warehousing work separate, not driven by BI value or business value, then we're falling out of that principle of having everything we do being driven by business value. I do know teams that have done this and it's worked well, and they have a strong self-management around making sure everything that's going into the warehouse, that's being done in the warehouse, is driven by business value. It might be a bigger picture. So I'm not going to say it always fails, but I am going to say a lot of agile transformations for data teams go wrong, go south when they do this. And it is the easiest, simplest thing to start with, but it's really a bad habit. So I encourage you to keep it all together where possible. So the other thing is you need to keep in mind, you don't need to break down all of the epics in the backlog right away, just the ones that are at the top of the backlog that are getting ready to be worked on. You can have big epics features and capabilities sitting at the bottom of the backlog if they're not of the business priority to be worked on next. And then the other thing that's really important to keep in mind is that slicing epics requires agile savvy customers who understand the value of doing an embryonic version first and then maturing it. So the way you get agile savvy customers is you don't just have your technical team get trained. You have your key business stakeholders, your business leads, or the people who are often coming to you and asking for things. You get them in the training too, so that they have a fair shot of understanding this thing called agile and why we would slice it small and what the benefit is to them. I see a lot of, and this just isn't just in data warehousing, but technical teams get trained in agile, and then they're so excited and they want to go do this, and then their business won't play. And they're frustrated and they're mad. And a lot of people will say, how do you get your business to participate? And I'll say, well, did you invite them to training? You know, if this is important to you, did you offer to, you know, include them in this? And they'll say, well, no. And I'll say, well, how would they know why they want to do this if they haven't been educated? So give them a fair shot of understanding. I also think it's really helpful when you're starting out to find a friendly person who has a good experience with your team and is really willing to try this agile thing. That the corporate properties group, that was the situation we were in. And that guy, that I think he was a director, he was very excited about this, and he sat through the training and you could see him kind of jumping or his face lighting up when he would realize how this was going to change his ability to perform his function and to serve their banking business. Okay, so here's an example of an epic. As a sales forecaster, I need the ability to see the daily revenue per store along with the number of transactions per day and the demographic profile of customers near each store, as well as the historical revenue for each store over the past 2 years, so that I can analyze and forecast revenue and buying trends. Now, what I will suggest is that this is probably, you know, technically a legitimate sentence in the English language, but I had to take actually 2 breaths this time to get through it all. So it's really a long sentence. We would call that a run-on sentence. So that's one of the easiest ways to figure out how to split epics, is look for those joining clauses. So along with and, as well as, you know, those kinds of things can really give you a sense of how you might split that epic. So in this case, you might start with daily revenue per store, the number of transactions per day, the demographic profile of customers near each store, and the historical revenue for each store over the past 2 years. So that takes one big story or epic and splits it into smaller ones that can then be further prioritized by the business. Another epic, this financial forecaster needs the ability to see profit and profit margin per customer per transaction for the top 10% of their customers so that he can identify the characteristics of the most profitable transactions. And so we might think about how could we simplify that, and an option is to take out some of the metrics. So there's profit, profit margin, and top 10% of customers. And you might take those out and say, now is this something that the team could do in the time-boxed amount of time that they've selected? Often that's 2 weeks. And then you think, what's the smallest, simplest thing that still is meaningful? So profit per customer per transaction is still meaningful for that financial forecaster. So start there and then add a story to add profit margin, and then have another story to do this for the top 10% of the customers. And those two other stories could be far apart in the backlog prioritization process. They don't have to be follow-on. They could be. They might be the next most important thing to work on. So you could also split epics based on customer value. I've sort of alluded to that when the past two, if you slice them down smaller and then have the customer prioritize those. So here's an example of focusing on the highest value aspects and deferring the lower value aspects until later. As a customer behavior analyst, I need a dashboard component that shows the top 30 customers who are most likely to attrite, along with their long-term value and their customer segment, so that I can recommend retention actions to customer support. So when we break this down, we might get lifetime value per customer, customer info per segment, customer defection index, and then a dashboard widget showing the top 30 likely defectors. This order is what after breaking it down into these four, this is what that customer behavior analyst, how they prioritized them. And what's interesting about this is the dashboard widget was the lowest priority to that person, and yet in the sentence above, it's the first thing that gets spoken. And our minds are naturally going to think, oh, they need a dashboard component. We're going to focus on that because we think that's most important because it comes first. But when you break it down and have this person actually think about the value of each of these things for their needs and filling their role in their company, they chose a different priority than how it was spelled out. So you could split your epics on data boundaries. You can isolate a story to a single data source, a single table, or even a single column. And I know that sounds ridiculously thin, but I've seen several teams do that and find that it is incredibly useful to them, especially as they're starting out in their Agile journey. So in this case, as a customer behavior analyst, I need to see the customer support incidents per customer together with the customer service reps who handled each call for all customers with 3 or more incidents in a 3-month period so that I can. So this person has a goal here that they're going to achieve. We could take the customer support incident report from the customer support database and then follow up later or at whatever appropriate time, getting the customer service rep detail for support incidents from the HR database. That would be an example of doing that. Some other techniques listed here that you can think about. You could split on operational boundaries. I think the most common one in the data warehousing world that we do would be to capture new data and not do change data capture at first, and then add change data capture later. You could defer ancillary concerns. So an example here with role-based access control was a project we were doing for a global sales team, and they were really, we kind of wanted to start with the security of who can see what, or the role-based access control of, if you're in this region and you work on this product and you have this named account, you can see this account kind of thing. However, they were really struggling to define those business rules. Not surprising to people who've worked with sales teams. It's complicated, and especially because there were some concern about a sales rep from one region seeing about a deal that a sales rep from another region has in the works. That first sales rep might go to the the local branch of whatever that business is and try and win the deal there. Because salespeople are competitive by nature, which is good, and that means they sell more stuff, but they were really sensitive about this. So what we did is we started building, we just put in one role that could see the data, and that was if you were part of the global sales ops team, you could then see all of the data, and if you weren't part of the global sales ops team, you couldn't see any of it. And so that was our single role-based access control to get started on our project. And then when the business caught up and could say, yes, here's clearly who needs to be in what group, then we could apply that later. So that's a way of getting started with something that's sufficient to start building and getting feedback, but it's not perfect and it's going to be made perfect later. You could also defer non-functional requirements, so making it work, then making it faster. Example of this was a very complicated revenue allocation business rule that had many business rules nested in it, and the problem the business was having was figuring out the order of computation, the order of how you apply these rules. And so we had a developer sit with the revenue recognition manager, and together they built something in the BI front end, which is really not meant to do this kind of deep crunching. but that hit the ERP system directly. And once a day, he'd do a pull of the prior day's sales or orders, shipped orders, which is how they recognize, well, it was one of the ways they recognized revenue. And he would do a pull, and then the BI system, the front end tool, and this was about 10 years ago. So imagine 10 years ago, these BI tools were not meant to crunch large volumes of data and do complicated calculations. It would run for a long time, but then she would get an output, the revenue recognition manager, and then she would evaluate that output and say, oh, these all look good, or whoops, I don't think that one really belongs there. And then they'd tweak the business rules that day, and it would run again the next morning for, I think, several hours, and then she would evaluate it. Once they got something that ran day after day and met her needs, it took a long time, and it was kind of fragile because it was going directly against our source system, so we had to really be careful with how we negotiated with that source system support team and make sure we weren't distracting. And then we finally were able to move that from the BI front end back into the ETL tool that was really meant to handle those kinds of things, and then it flew. But it saved us time deploying ETLs and updating our ETL runs and all of that by making it work first in the front end but slowly, and then making it better and faster and hardening it into the back end later on. So we do want to watch out for anti-stories or things that are not stories, but they might sound like them. So as a financial analyst, I need to know that the data model will correctly house all of the data I need so that I can conduct a variety of revenue and profit analyses. It sounds like a user story as a I need so that, but really if you look at what they're asking for, this is our job. This is the how. The data model will correctly house all of the data. This is a no duh, and it doesn't tell us what we need to build. And it's sort of getting into how. So it's really not a user story, even though it sounds like it. Here's another one. As a financial analyst, I need to know that the ETL code correctly maps data from the transactions database into the warehouse. That's really kind of a definition of done, or their acceptance criteria. How will you know that it correctly maps data? They need to give us examples, and then we can say, okay, here we can prove to you that it does. But this isn't a user story. This is more of a technical standard, actually. So we want to think, does the story still make sense without the data warehouse or the BI or the technology? Remove the words that are specific to our technology and see if there's any business value left. And can you demonstrate the result to a user? How would you do a demo? How would you script that demo? What would you show? And if you can't demonstrate it, it's not a well-written user story. So you might imagine ridiculously simple user stories. So for example, I gave the example of pulling just one field through, and that some teams have really had some success starting with something that ridiculously simple to learn about their agile process. So you might think about, okay, we're used to boiling the ocean with our data warehousing projects and having all the big design up front and all the requirements before we start building. But what if we just boiled a little bit of it? What if we just did a little slice? So you want to think about how would this help your project and how would it hurt your project? Because there are, pros and cons to every choice we make. If I were in a classroom, we would take some time and make lists of how it's helpful and how it's hurtful, and we would compare those and talk about it. Because we're not in a classroom, I'm just going to share with you what people typically come up with as the benefits of small slices or very small user stories. So if you have a if your user story basically asks for one field at a time to build out a report, let's just use that as the example of a ridiculously small user story. It does make it easier to honor your iteration commitments. A sprint is a term used in the Scrum framework, but other frameworks have iterations as well. So if you're going to say for the next 2 weeks, we're going to accomplish these 5 stories, and each story is a single field, it's easier to imagine if you can actually accomplish that. If your top 5 stories are all kind of big and hard to imagine, your team might go, I think we can do number 1. I don't think we can do any more than that, right? So it makes it harder to imagine what you can commit to and what you can honor. Smaller stories avoid having hangovers. So hangover is a term in the development world that refers to, or the Agile world specifically, that refers to not quite getting your story done in that iteration. So typically things that don't quite get done are tests that fail, but you don't think it's a big deal to fix them, or doing the documentation that you need to do to keep up with your end documentation requirements, what you need to have for user training or support and maintenance when it's in production. Those are the kinds of things that we call hangover, and that teams typically try to kind of scramble and do the next morning at the start of their next sprint, which then just eats into the next sprint and really can be a problem. Smaller stories really reduce complexity. So I kind of talked about that, about how to make and honor your commitments. Smaller work reduces defects. It's harder to make a mistake on smaller work. Tiny stories are also less expensive to rework. So if you do a tiny bit of work and you find out from your business, oh, that wasn't quite right. I thought I asked, I needed that field and I said that, but now that I see it, it's not the right field. It's easier to go back and replace that field with a different one than to find that out at the very end and get a list of 100 things that aren't right and have to go back and fix them. And it is easier to define acceptance criteria. I mentioned acceptance criteria is pretty difficult, and that the business stakeholder often needs help from data-focused BA and often testers to help define acceptance criteria. The smaller the story is, the easier, the more clear your goal will be, because it's easier to define it. And therefore, it is also easier to test. So we're back to our little architecture here that we saw a moment ago, where we go from source data through stage, integration, warehouse, OLAP, and BI in this example. And we're going to talk about some thin slicing points in each of these stages of the architecture. So you want to think about how can you shrink each step. So this is along the lines of make it run and then make it better. Or, how do you get something barely sufficient out there, barely, but still sufficient, and then continue to evolve that to be healthier and more serving the business long term. So when we think about our user stories come in here at the BI apps front end, there's so many different things we can do with our front end, some of which take more time than others. So an easy example here would be you might just start revealing the data they need in a tabular report just so they can look at the data and they can evaluate it. And then make it fancier and more intuitive and more colorful down the road. In your OLAP or your cube layer, you could do a variety of things. The one I like here as an example is data naming. I've been on teams where we get something, we turn it around in 2 days from when we have the story conversation, and we don't rename the fields to the business labels. We just pull through what is in the source system. And I've even done this with source systems that were ported over from mainframe and had, make sure I didn't put myself on mute, okay, and had the field names were like MZQ1249, and they made no sense, but the business was willing to kind of do that translation and be like, okay, that's the field I'm looking at and that's what this means. And then we go back later and put the proper business label on it. In our warehouse layer, there's different levels of derived facts. You could start with something simpler and then get it more specific as you learn what the business really needs. The conformed dimensions, this is something we all want. We all want conformed dimensions in the data world. It just makes our lives so much better. One project, we had the company, we were doing something that had to do with geography and finances, like dollars, and there were 7 different geographical hierarchies in the company. And the main contenders were finance and sales, had different opinions of what a geography was. Not wildly different, but the financial definition had to do with legal entities, and the sales definition had more to do with proximity and language, especially when you're thinking about places in like Europe and Asia that are very close to each other. And so while they figured that out, we went ahead and built out the functionality that they needed with a drop-down that you could switch between the sales hierarchy and the finance hierarchy. So we didn't wait until they were ready to conform that dimension, and we could have added more hierarchies if we needed to, but the other 5 were willing to either align with sales or finance. So that's something you can do sufficiently to get going and then make it better later when you have a conformed dimension. At the integration layer, data hygiene is the example I like there. I am a fan of pulling through ugly data at the beginning and letting the business really see what the data is, because typically it's beyond our control what is input into the system and what guardrails are on those front end systems to make sure what's input is useful. And so I think this is something that absolutely can be deferred once the business decides, A, if there's value in enhancing the data quality, and then B, what are the business rules we should apply to do that. But you could pull through what we would call dirty data and let them look at it, and typically people in the business can still get some value out of that. They can get, you know, a general sense, directionally correct sense of how things are going with whatever their business decision is. From a staging layer, you know, stage is typically just of some sort of copy and paste from source, some sort of, you know, not a lot of changes to the structure. But you could start with just a snapshot, and then you could add a snapshot that retains the old data but brings in new data, and then you could add change data capture down the road if you needed to limit the amount of work you did in each layer. And then even at our source data, there might be things that we like to do with the source data before we even start pulling it into stage that maybe we could slim down those activities and get what's barely sufficient to start the process. Now, one of the things I've said is that in this this just-in-time design and development, which you might consider a thin steel wire pulling through all the layers of our architecture, and think about a suspension bridge held up by cables. That's a bunch of thin steel wires twisted together to hold up a very heavy weight. The one thing that I see consistently that Agile teams tend to do is they tend to stage a much greater amount of data than they pull through the other layers of their application, because building the interaction with the source data and the staging mechanism is so much more technically efficient to pull it all. And if you do get to the point where you're automatically doing change data capture when you stage data, then you're preserving a wealth of information that can be pulled through these other layers later on and provide historical perspective. So that's the one thing that I have, frankly, yet seen a good reason why you wouldn't do that in an Agile world, because it's easier and faster to stage a whole table than just fields at a time. And as long as you're not pulling it through your integration and having it be something that you absolutely have to test at every layer and that you have to support in production at every layer, you're not creating waste down the road.
Hi, Lynn, this is Anil. I just wanted to let you know we have just about a minute left in the session,
okay.
But yeah, didn't want to panic
Thank
you.
you for telling me that. Nope, I appreciate my clock is off a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to recap here. User stories are not about the data. A user story represents a requirement to be discussed at the right time. You want to focus on architecturally complete user stories so that the business value drives everything we do. An epic is anything too big for an iteration. Other than that, you need to decide your nomenclature for your other hierarchies, your hierarchy there. And you want to get creative about how you slice epics. What's the smallest, simplest result for which a user can give us useful feedback? Back to the Agile principles. So important Agile principles to keep in mind when writing user stories is that they need to be small, because our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable insight. Another reason for them being small is we welcome changing requirements even late in development. So Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage, and we can do that by having small pieces of work that allow us to focus on one thing while the business is prioritizing or figuring out another thing. And working insight is the primary measure of progress in an Agile team. And that is the end of it. Anil, do you have some things to say here?
Yeah, that was a great presentation, and we had several questions come in, but I think you've addressed actually most of them. For those of you that have asked any questions that Lynn didn't actually answer, she will be seeing those after this session concludes. So thanks a lot for participating on that. Our next session that's coming up is going to be called an Introduction to Global Data Quality, and it's going to be presented by Oscar Lee. And so we'll be jumping onto that. Hope you can join us for that as well. I just wanted to say thanks to Lynn once more, and thanks to all of our attendees.